Welcome back to Historic Investments. I thought what we'd look at today is the elusive and highly desirable ZFK 55. I could tell you a lot about the history, but you probably already know. So why don't we just jump in and look at what you need to know about if you're going to buy one for yourself. For those of you interested in the K31s, you probably know there were only 3 scoped variants. All of them are referred to as ZFKs.
Zielfernrohrkarabiner.
I was going to try to pronounce it, but with cell phones, who needs that? So, the ZFK 55 was developed in 1955, and exactly 4,150 guns were made. It was a vast improvement over the previous snipers. Not as rare if you take the total of all of the K3142s and the K3143s. The total was only 2,240 guns of both types. This, as mentioned, was 4,150, but it's clearly the best. It's very different from the previous guns. It's got a much thicker, heavier barrel. It's got a massive muzzle brake flash suppressor, which I don't know why you really need it for a sniper rifle, but it's pretty cool to have a bayonet lug under it. Unlike the earlier guns, it's got a shortened stock. It still retains the 1:15 adjustable tangent rear sight. It's got a very cool, and for this type of gun, very respectable scope with a 3.5 power. The other ones, again, were 1.8 power for the 3142, 2.8 for the 3143. Again, this is 3.5 power. A much heavier gun, full pistol grip, nicely checkered, and it retains the steel butt plate of the earlier guns. While designed in 1955, it was only made for 4 years. 1957, 58, 59, and then there was a trail over of a small number of parts that were assembled after 1960. For those of you who have decided this is the gun for me, there are only a few numbered parts on the rifle, but then of course you have to make sure that the scope is matched to the rifle along with the scope can. So, after having taken kind of the long view of the gun, why don't we look at some of the details? One of the things that you should be asking yourself as a collector is the wear consistent throughout the weapon? In other words, is the wear and fading of the blue consistent with the Mars scuffing and staining of the wood? If you have an example like this, which is moderately well used, the answer is yes. You see a number of discolored, oil-stained nicks, gashes. You see some fading and scuffs on the metal. Everything is consistent. Has the stock been refinished? Probably not. Has the metal been refinished? Probably not. Everything is faded, worn, and consistent. By the same token, the guns had very different service lives depending on where they were issued, or in some cases not issued. This would be a pristine example. The beach stock is virtually unused, maybe a few just tiny little finger dents in it. The metal is perfect, the scope is perfect, the can is perfect. So again, those are all very good signs. The next thing you do is you get the gun in your hands, take a look at it, and make sure that all the components are matching. First are the components on the rifle itself, then of course is the scope and the carrying case. So what do you look for in these guns? Well, first is the cardinal serial number on the receiver. Let's take a look at that. Here's where you find the serial number. It's on the left side of the receiver. Again, it's a 4-digit number between 1001 and 5,150. Again, a total of 4,150 of these guns were completed. Here's the main serial number. The serial number then is repeated on the barrel. One of the things you should look for at the serial number of the barrel is to see if the metal is raised around the digital impressions. The barrel was finished, the serial number was struck, the metal was never polished. So the metal around these impressions should be raised and slightly faded. What about the bolt? The bolt is externally numbered with large digits in a very visible location. The fourth item that's serial numbered on the gun is the magazine. ZFK car, followed by the full serial number on the bottom of the magazine. That's it as far as the gun is concerned. The next thing is the scope. The scope is numbered on the top, and while some collectors, usually older collectors, like to accentuate the markings with a white grease pencil, these scopes were marked in a off-white color from the factory. It's a kind of a yellowish eggshell white. The scope number is in large digits, followed by the kern marking underneath. These scopes are to be used from 100 to 800 meters. They've got a ballistic drop compensator in them, and then the reticle consists of a vertical pointed post bordered by two pointed horizontal brackets. The scopes are easily detached from the mount by a very stiff plunger. As mentioned, the scope bases are integral to the receiver. The scopes were issued with matching cans, and as mentioned, the markings on the scope are a little bit eggshell white or yellowish white. The numeration on the can is usually a very light yellow. The can itself is more of an olive green. All the cans were issued with a scope adjustment tool, otherwise unmarked, but it's got a unique and very easily recognizable configuration. There are some variations in the coloration, as you might expect, over several years of production. You know, most of the cans are a khaki colored and have got a little bit of a brighter surface sheen to them. Some of the later cans, the methodology of numeration was the same. You can see the coloring and the numbers is a little bit brighter, and you can see, if you look really carefully, you can see that the surface texturing is a little different in terms of how the painting or the painting texture dried. So this is much brighter, and this is the one in my left hand right here is a little bit of a duller color. When not in use, the scope can be very easily and handily transported, and more importantly, securely transported in this metal carrying case with rubber end fittings that locks in place nicely over the scope, after which the can can either be carried on the belt or put in the backpack for convenient transport. All of the K55s were fitted with a very cool bipod. As mentioned, the bipod is not numbered. It's foldable. It's freely rotatable. And when it was finished, it was also finished in a glossy, black, hard-baked enamel finish, very similar to, say, what FN uses on its weapons. Some of the later guns have a duller finish on this component. And let me show you by contrast. This is a later gun with a duller finish on the bipod. But as you can see, it's otherwise, this example is otherwise near new. One of the last things that you might want to look for when having these weapons in hand, and maybe there's a question as to whether or not it was restocked, is you look right here at the cartouche on the stock. When originally finished, this is an acceptance marking that was applied late. These are shellac finished stocks, and this should be deeply imprinted. After the gun's been used and scuffed, sometimes these get a little bit worn. It was not at all uncommon to have the stocks refinished either individually or at the arsenal level. Let's take our near new example and look at that. And here's an example of a cartouche as it would have appeared fresh from the factory. A couple of other things you should keep in mind before making your final selection is, number one, you really need to do a better evaluation of the scope. So far we've talked about some of the external considerations, but what about internally? After all, this is a sniper rifle. You want to evaluate the optics. Put the gun to your shoulder, look through the scope. Are the optics clear, or or do they have a yellowish haze? Most of the K55s really have exceptionally clear optics. Of course, you also need to make sure that the controls work. Here's the elevation. The knob off to the side is to adjust the crossbars. Make sure you take the bolt out, look at the bore. Again, you're buying a sniper rifle. You want a gun with a nice mirror bore and strong rifling, at least if possible. And finally, even though it's a lot more fun sometimes to watch videos and to read a book, if you're a serious collector and you really have an interest in Swiss rifles, a number of years ago, Joe Poyer wrote a nice softback reference on the Swiss magazine loading rifles. It's relatively inexpensive and readily obtainable even now on the internet. So I'd encourage you to buy a copy and just have it as a nice reference and thumbnail guide. Well, at that point, you should have enough information to decide if indeed this is an all-original K55. You know about which serial numbers to look for. You know where the scope markings are located. You know how to check to see if the scope serial number matches the gun. You know how the can is finished, how the cans are serial numbered. And with this information, you should be well armed to make your own decision purchase. Thank you once again for having joined Historic Investments. We hope you enjoyed this presentation and look forward to seeing you again in the future.